Welcome to Arctic 360's Summer 2024 podcast series, Breaking the Ice. I'm one of your hosts, Nicole Butler, and this season I'll be joined by Nazia and Jaden as well. Our podcast series theme is Summer of North American Maritime Security, where we delve into the big issues concerning the people and politics facing the Canadian North and the whole of the Arctic region. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to bring you informed and engaging discussions with local and international experts who can help us understand the pressing debates shaping the North American Arctic maritime and security landscape. Today's episode, our first episode of the season, will cover defense infrastructure and strategy in the North. Today's guests are former Canadian MP Erin O'Toole and Chair of the Board of Canada's largest mining company, Agnico Eagle, Sean Boyd. Both guests have long-standing personal and professional connections with Canada's North, and within their work, they are advocates for an Arctic strategy that properly recognizes the opportunities that lie within this region for all of Canada. In today's discussion, we will touch on topics like developing and implementing an Arctic strategy, the role of technology and innovation, and how multi-sectoral cooperation is key to building up defense infrastructure for long-term Arctic strategy success.
Well, welcome to our inaugural 2024 Breaking the Ice podcast episode. I'm Jessica Shadian. I'm the president and CEO of Arctic 360. We have an excellent first show today with two of Canada's big thought leaders on all things Arctic, but particularly on Canada's North. But before we get into their introduction, I'd like to actually have our three interns and co-producers of our Breaking the Ice series introduce themselves. So, Nicole, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Jessica. Erin and Sean, thank you so much for being here. My name's Nicole Butler. I'm originally from Calgary, Alberta, and I graduated from Western University for my undergrad, but I'm currently living in Washington, D.C., pursuing a master's in security studies at Georgetown University.
Thank you, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I'm Nazia Shah. I'm from Montreal. I graduated from McGill University in International Development Studies, and I'm currently a master's student at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy.
Thanks, Nazia. I'm Jaden Stevens. I'm from Northern Wells, Northwest Territories. I'm running a digital marketing company in Northwest Territories, and I'm excited to be helping with this podcast this summer.
And I will just add on one thing there with Jaden. So Jaden comes to us as part of a collaboration that we have with Satu Secretariat Incorporated. And also Jaden is working on another podcast series called, not to be confused with Breaking the Ice, but Breaking Ice Productions. And so that's another podcast series that if anyone wants to listen to, they definitely should. So I'll let you guys take it away.
I'll start with Erin. Tell us a bit about yourself. You were an MP and recently returned to the private sector. Your time in the Arctic, or your time as an MP, the Arctic was high on your priorities. Can you tell us a bit about your insights as an elected official and whether you're able to focus more on the Arctic now that you're in the private sector?
Well, thanks, Jaden, and thanks, Jessica. It's good to be with you. It's good to break the ice and literally break the ice for the first time for this podcast. Great question, Jaden. My love and interest in our North, in the Arctic, really came from my years in the RCF, in the military, when I first flew with a Hercules crew into our North and just saw some of the incredible challenges. We landed and stayed a few days in Iqaluit, and I was also privy to some of the box top, what we'd call supply missions for the station at Alert, run out of Trenton. And I saw just the incredible challenge a relatively small or now medium-sized country had guarding and safeguarding the Arctic because it was such a vast region. Now we had the Canadian Rangers as our on-the-ground partners. And so that's really when my interest was piqued. And I'd studied a bit about the Arctic when I was at Royal Military College. So fast forward, 15 years later, after a legal career, one of the first issues I started really advocating for as a new member of Parliament was the Arctic infrastructure investments, partnerships with Inuit and Indigenous peoples. And so I'm going to continue to do that because this is an area of interest that predated my time in elected office. And it's been great to partner with Arctic 360, which I think is not only Canada's leading think tank on issues related to the Arctic, but is slowly emerging as one of the most important international ones to bring these issues to the forefront. So I'm really, really privileged to be here with you today.
Thank you for your response, Erin. Now on to Sean. Agnico has been operating in the Arctic for several decades, as we know. You've spent most of your career with Agnico. Can you tell us a bit about your own introduction to the North and your northern experiences up to now?
Sure. It's great to be here, and thank you for the question, Nazia. Agnico's involvement in the Arctic and my first visit to the Arctic was in 2007. And we were looking at a junior company that had a project called Meadowbank. And we went to Baker Lake in 2007 to meet the community, meet the elders, and get a sense from our perspective whether it was going to be a good place to do business. And we left after 2 or 3 days. And on the way back with our senior team, we concluded, that region, Nunavut in Canada, would be a perfect match to our collective skills, which we had developed over multiple decades in southern Canada. So that's one of the principal reasons why Agnico's now taken the approach that we should do more in sharing what we've learned being in Nunavut about the opportunity that exists with the people of the North and with the resource potential and the potential to build a broader economy. So we're excited about the opportunities, and I'm sure as we talk more about the opportunity set, we'll be able to talk about our Hope Bay project, which is a project that's really going to be important given its physical location and what it can do in Western Nunavut. So there's lots going on, and we appreciate the opportunity to work with Jessica and the team here with Arctic 360 to help us get that message about what we see as a huge opportunity in Canada's North.
Yeah, definitely. I think many people see that opportunity. Both of your answers, I think, show us how multi-sectoral the Arctic is. And so this goes out to both of you, but Sean, we'll start with you. What would you say is the biggest change about Canada's North that you've seen since starting working on Arctic issues?
Well, I think we've seen a few things recently where now we're getting a realization from all levels of government, and I think more importantly from the federal government, that mining's important. Mining's important for Canada, but it's particularly important in the North because it's going to be the basis and foundation of economic wealth creation for Nunavut, for the Northwest Territories, for the Yukon, and the people that live and reside there. So I think it's that acceptance now that we need to create the conditions for resource development to be successful, but also to do it in a way where we're maximizing that opportunity because everybody's coordinating their efforts. So we've been really pleasantly surprised with that. And I've said many times, I've been doing this for 39 years, and I've spent more time in Ottawa in the last 8 months than I have in 39 years. And it's because of that realization that there's lots to do, and there's lots to do in a way that we're going to be able to benefit not just the people that live in the North, but all of Canada as we think about that investment opportunity that exists there.
Right. That's great to hear. Sean, you've been vocal and active in calling for Canada to have an Arctic strategy. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your vision for that is?
Listen, building on what Sean just said, I think it's fantastic that people are reminding themselves of our leadership in mining and extraction, not just from the actual on the site, but raising capital. There's so many jobs not far from me in Toronto dependent on our success as an exploration company, one that takes risks. So I agree with him. I'm glad mining is kind of back in vogue, if you can say that. But the change I think is most important dovetails perfectly with what Sean's doing, and that's economic reconciliation with Inuit Indigenous peoples. We passed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and there was a lot of people suggesting that these were going to be roadblocks or vetoes or stop. I've seen incredible partnerships created with Indigenous-led development companies and very smart, progressive companies like Agnico benefiting from traditional knowledge, from a workforce, from partnerships to the point that now we're seeing wealth created in communities that really have had very little opportunity. That's probably been the real failure of the Canadian story, is the success of Canada didn't translate into every corner of our country, and some of the generational trauma that Indigenous and Inuit people had um, was perpetuating a lack of success and a lack of opportunity that other Canadians took for granted. Now we're seeing intergenerational wealth transfer in some of these communities. That is incredible, and it's a massive change. Even from the time that I was first elected, there were no real partnerships being forged with jobs or equity partnerships or supply agreements or, you know, long-term relationships between the corporate sector and Indigenous groups. Now we have groups like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. We have at Arctic 360 corporate leaders with Indigenous backgrounds, you know, taking lead roles. We're seeing the Infrastructure Bank and other institutions really taking these partnerships seriously. So I think the timing for the North is excellent, because with the race for critical minerals, rare earths, traditional metals, there's now a partnership and an eagerness from a lot of these communities to really move. And when you have smart companies like Agnico, they can become world leaders, and it's a benefit to all Canadians, but particular Inuit and Indigenous.
Yeah, for sure. So we'll jump back, Sean, there. Jumping on top of that, in the intersection between rising opportunities such as critical mineral development, what is your vision for what you think Canada, or what Agnico thinks Canada's Arctic strategy should be?
Well, I think what we've learned, there's been a lot of discussion, and as many will know, that discussion even goes as far back as the late 50s, early 60s on the need for an Arctic strategy. So lots of discussion, but we think it's the time for action. And I think that's important. Now, there are things that are happening, and I think we see the federal government acknowledging that we have some defense responsibilities up there, and we've seen that in the recent announcement where we're going to spend $8 billion there. The trick will be is to coordinate everything, and to do it in a way where we're actually leveraging off of each of the inputs so that we become really efficient in how we deploy the capital, not just the financial capital, but the people capital. So I think that's the opportunity, and it's how it all fits together. And the challenge with mining is that it's still a tough business, and it's extremely difficult in places where there's a lack of infrastructure. So it's going to take time, but it's also going to take long-term thinking. So this isn't going to be done overnight, but we need to get started. And I'll just use an example. Is we've been engaging with the Department of National Defense now for the last few months, and we've suggested some potential opportunities to work together. And in fact, that started at the Arctic 360 earlier this year when we had on the panel that Erin led, we had an individual working for the Department of National Defense. And we've seen a recent purchase of an airline hangar in the north by the Department of National Defense. So we've gone a little bit further than that. We've said, you know, we have a situation where our Meadowbank mine will likely be mined out, let's say, in 4 years. Well, there's an opportunity for us to transfer assets potentially to the federal government and the Department of National Defense, where we have an airstrip where Prime Minister Harper flew the Hercules into that airstrip. There's energy generating capacity there. There's a camp there. It's fully outfitted so that it could be repurposed potentially. And we've also said around our Hope Bay project, we've said to the Department of National Defense, well, if we're going to build $1 billion+ mine that's likely going to last for decades, why wouldn't you be looking at doing something in the vicinity of that operation? We could help you maintain it potentially. We could keep the cost down in terms of construction. So really what we see is it's time to start moving. And what we bring, and this is what we've been very insistent on making very clear is mining companies can get things done very quickly and very efficiently, and a lot quicker than governments can get things done. So we're suggesting to them, let's work together and let's get things done, because we can move quickly as long as we get and work together on a plan to get things done. So how it all unfolds over the next little while is hard to really predict, except what we do know based on being there every single day since 2007, starting with the building of Meadowbank, you have to start moving now.
Let me add to
Definitely. I
that
think
because I think with stakeholders, um, once stakeholders start coordinating efforts and there's force multipliers, like you're multiplying the impact of private sector investment, as Sean talked about, alongside public, alongside local or even indigenous led, you're then having a multiplier effect rather than everyone doing things in their own little silos. They can be stakeholders, but they're not coordinated. So we now have a real window, and I really think the leadership of Arctic 360 is kind of showing the way. That conference brings together more people with an interest in the North than anything that happens in Ottawa annually. So, how can we make sure that the federal government plays a role as a reliable funding partner, as someone that is not scared to partner with the private sector or with Indigenous led business groups? So, that's probably the most exciting thing about long-term infrastructure and defense and security and the economy in the North is finally the strategy is coming together because the various groups are demanding it. It's not because the government is saying you do this, you do this. It's there's already these partnerships being forged, and I've long been a proponent of the private sector being a part of it because they can bring that execution that government has trouble with. And so we're now at a point that so many of the partnerships are so far ahead of the federal government in terms of a national strategy that it's forcing them to come to the table. And I think that would be great because what is needed and what I've been advocating for as a conservative, but working with liberals like John McKay and others, we need to make long-term infrastructure and security in the Arctic bipartisan so that it doesn't get abandoned when there's a change of government, because you need 10 to 20-year plans to really build out this infrastructure, whether it's roads, ports, facilities, generation, transmission. And if you start zigzagging because of an election here or in a minority parliament here, you're never going to get things done. So let's hope that that political continuity is a cornerstone of an eventual federal strategy.
Absolutely. I think Canada can see how some of our Arctic partners, such as the U.S., can be held back by swings in elections. And so I think that's a good point. But it's one thing to say we need a strategy and this is what the strategy should look like, and it's a whole other thing to bring it into fruition. So Erin, we'll start with you, and then Sean, you can jump in. But given that, what do you envision could be the best mechanism for creating this strategy and this roadmap? Is there a certain house that should lead it, or department that should step up?
Well, I would really like to see leadership from the Prime Minister and from a cabinet level for this, mainly because it really takes that level of political capital to get things done. When I was in the cabinet with Stephen Harper, we had Leona Glukuk, who was at the cabinet table, a northerner. She had chaired the Arctic Council, the first Inuit from Canada to do that. We made investments in three areas: research with the High Arctic Research Station, CHARS, the road to Tuktoyaktuk, the first road to the Arctic Ocean, and the Nanisivik Naval Port. Now I'm looking at, if we'd had the private sector, if we'd had Indigenous and other partners at the table for those foundational long-term investments, we actually probably would have located the naval facility in a slightly different place. We might have had better integration of Indigenous-led businesses as some of the partners, which we're now seeing for the maintenance of the North Warning System, for example, an investment that I was calling for, gosh, 6 years before Anita Anand made it, and I praised her when she did make it. So I think that cabinet level leadership, there needs to be buy-in from the Prime Minister and a lead cabinet member hopefully from the north, but really just making sure you have someone effective is most important. And then I think the strategy really needs to be partnerships and a long-term approach to funding. So if we're going to build new infrastructure, like the Nanisivik Naval Port, which Harper announced probably around 2009, is still not completed. That is how challenging the infrastructure is in the north. So you need that vision. We saw the vision with Diefenbaker when their government built Inuvik and had kind of a roads to resources strategy way back in the Diefenbaker era. We need that long-term vision from the federal government. When I ran for conservative leader and ran to be prime minister, I had said the federal government should upload all infrastructure in the north under the guise of sovereignty protection and national security. That meant the territories could have their limited budgets for more local delivery and services related for people living in the north. And the federal government should be in charge of aerodromes, ports, roads, and make long-term, like I'm talking 20-year investments to realize the vision we need.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. And so, as I said, we spent a lot of time in Ottawa in the last 8 months or so, and we're not there looking for anything. We're just there to explain and outline what we see as the opportunity set in the north. Like, we're actually there to generate interest and to get the buy-in from the government, and not just to say, yeah, that sounds good, but to actually say, okay, we're prepared to move now. And that's going to be the tricky part. And this is how we've tried to do it, because you can't really push them because there's lots of priorities. And we basically say we're going to continue to invest regardless what the government does in terms of their investment in infrastructure. That's our business. We can actually get things done and we can do it efficiently. But what we're trying to do around the Hope Bay project is to create a big stage and explain it in a way where we show that it connects all the policy dots. And we're basically almost creating a stage to invite the government to join us on the stage when we get to the point that we're going to announce this investment. And that investment's critical, as everybody knows, that was a project that the federal government decided that a Chinese mining entity could not own it. And so it sits there on the northern coast. So it's got a physical presence and a location that's strategic. And so what we've been saying is that our strategy of stepping into the shoes of the Chinese entity to take that deal in a matter of a couple of weeks once the federal government made that decision, our plan was to rework it, to understand it, to figure out a way to make it bigger. We're getting close to the point where we've got something that's going to be bigger. It'll be sometime next year. There's still work to do. There's still work to do on return. But again, we're thinking long term here because it's on a major geological belt. But what we're saying to the federal government is, why don't you use an announcement like this, which could come in the first half of next year, to meet all of your policy goals and to work with us to supply capital to the Kitikmeot Inuit Association so they can be the owners of a wind farm that will supply 50% of the power. The government announced an Indigenous loan program. Well, there's a way then for the Inuit groups to own part of the physical infrastructure there, to participate in the ultimate future growth of that project. So we're trying to outline some action steps which will allow them to demonstrate that they're serious about defense, they're serious about sovereignty, they're serious about creating opportunities for economic and advancement in Indigenous communities. There's lots of things that are connected to this project. So what we're also doing, and you'll see us doing more in the next 12 months, is we've taken it upon ourselves to do a lot of social media advocacy around this concept: mind building, community building, nation building. And this tends to resonate with communities and with politicians. There's a long way to go to get there, but we know the economic multiplier and impacts that a Hope Bay can have for Western Nunavut. So we're pushing, and we're going to continue to push. And our experience in 60 years is in parts of the world where infrastructure is lacking and there isn't a real well thought out plan, industry just has to put their head down and go, because what that does is that forces everybody to come along. And that's our sort of idea and concept around how we're creating this big stage around Hope Bay, which could be the normal run of the mill. Yeah, we're going to restart this mine. No, we want to make it much bigger, and we want to connect community building to it and nation building to it, given the importance of where it is in northern Canada.
Nicole, we're going to move on a bit and broaden it out, but I just have one quick follow-up for both of you. And maybe we don't need to do this, but we talk about an Arctic strategy. Does this, though, need to be housed within its own entity, and therefore that can bring all the different departments of the federal government, let's say, together? Because in my own experience, when you have many different departments involved in something, they kind of pass it off. They just assume that the others are going to do something. And so we end up in a standstill, and also in silos. And so is this something that we need to bring together into one particular pot, in one particular file? And if so, where would that be?
Knowing Ottawa as I do, there would be no way that Department of National Defense, for example, would give up its leadership or its management over its own facilities, just the nature of defense and security. But I also don't think it's right to then say, okay, national defense will be the department that runs economic development or, issues related to power generation or something on the economic front. I think this could be handled, Jessica, quite simply by a strategy that gives the Privy Council office, which is kind of the advisor to cabinet, to make sure that there's coordination. I've also said the PCO should have a designated disaster response mechanism as well. But the Privy Council could make sure that they navigated the departments coming into conflict by keeping them in line with the strategy. And if the strategy should have deliverables, it should have predictable budgets, it should have partnerships with outside groups, including the private sector, I think it could really be run that way. The bigger challenge we often trip over in Canada is federal-provincial relations. This is less of an issue here because of the territories. There's much more of a federal role. And it's why I've said the federal government should upload fiscal responsibility for many of these things so that easy partnerships with Indigenous Development Corps and territories could be done, and they don't need assembly approval or anything like this. So I think this could be achievable, but Ottawa would have to be much more open to a strategy that engaged partners like the private sector and like the Indigenous development sector.
Yeah, and it can be done. And so our outreach has been extensive. We just haven't gone to Ottawa and talked to natural resources, Indian Northern Affairs. We've gone beyond that. Foreign Affairs, Department of National Defense, Prime Minister's Office, Privy Council. We've gone across the board, and that's kind of unusual for a mining company, largely talking about the potential to, restart Hope Bay. And that's done on purpose because we want the entire cabinet table to know what industry's doing in the north. We want them to know that. And when we first started there 8 months ago, we had a number of people in Ottawa not even knowing that Agnico was the largest mining company in Canada by market cap. So we had to sort of educate them a little bit. But I have to say the reception has been incredibly good. And there's a desire to do something, but it's always the how. Is how do we actually do it? And so we are going to need leadership from the federal government. Why? Because the federal government has to make the case to 40 million Canadians why this is important. There's lots of priorities. 40 million Canadians are going to write the check here, ultimately. And as Erin says, it has to be a consistent check over a long period of time, so that we can all collectively pool our resources together and know where we're spending and how do we leverage off of that. So we need leadership at the federal level to work alongside industry and work alongside the communities. And the communities are basically raring to go, raring to participate. They want to see economic opportunity there. And we all know this has to come from responsible resource development to start. And if you do that properly, you can layer on other industries over top of that as this starts to take hold. So there's tremendous opportunity. And we think our role now, not just as a mining company that operates in the north, but as Canadians running the largest mining company in Canada by market cap for over 60 years with lots of skills, we see it now as our responsibility to start to put some visibility around the opportunity that we see, which is tremendous.
Let me add just two quick compliments on that, because there's leadership forming in Ottawa on these issues, but I want to compliment Sean and Agnico's leadership on this. The fact that you are going and in many cases educating senior parts of the government doesn't always happen. And there's often, people avoid going to Ottawa because it's usually you get called in front of the committees and grilled, or, so people aren't investing the time and the thought leadership that you and Agnico have. I also want to compliment Jessica and Arctic 360, because I saw the U.S. ambassador, Mr. Cohen, about a month ago, and we were talking about the conference, which he attended for the first time, and he was impressed. There's very few gatherings where you have diplomatic leadership, thought leadership, corporate leaders, you have philanthropic leaders, you have indigenous leaders coming together to hash out a policy or a priority. And so we're seeing thought leadership from people like Sean, people like Jim Balzilli, who spoke at Arctic 360. And I think that is lighting a fire under the behinds of folks in government. And that's why I'm so excited. There really is a window for a long-term strategy here and long-term benefit for Northerners, including Inuit. So we've got to really seize this momentum, and that's why breaking the ice is exciting as well. We've got some momentum in the north. Let's keep it going.
You both have talked about how part of this strategy too, there's potential to connect it with sovereignty protection and national security. Do you see there even being a broader geopolitical coordination potential with strategic partnership building? And this can be in terms of coordinating North American Arctic maritime infrastructure with strategic partners, or even playing into Canada meeting its 2% NATO obligations?
Let me jump in there. Yes. And if you actually look at some of the news stories in the last few months where comments have been leaked out from NATO discussions or others, our allies want Canada to take the lead on the geopolitical and security significance of the Arctic. They're desperate for it, to be honest with you. And so the fact that we have been silent and rather absent from the discussion is upsetting to our allies. The fact that the Prime Minister, the first time he attended Operation Nanook, the annual Canadian Armed Forces exercise in the North, was when the NATO Secretary General was coming to see it. That was the first time Prime Minister Trudeau went. Prime Minister Harper went every year, and a few years Lorraine Harper attended, because projection of your sovereignty is not just boots on the ground and the Canadian Rangers out there and investments. It's also the leadership showing that we think the Arctic is important. It's people, it's territory, it's resources. And so I really do think, it was positive that the North Warning System investment came. If you notice, that came within weeks of the Russian full invasion of Ukraine. The government finally woke up to the realities of geopolitics, which is we have a maritime Arctic border with Russia, who has just invaded a neighboring country. China calls itself a near Arctic state. That's not even a real diplomatic term. They've just asserted that. And with climate change, the Northwest Passage, alongside the Northeast Passage, Russia's Arctic and polar routes, these are going to be more active. And, when I was in the North for a study, Inuit leaders and rangers were telling us they've seen submarines snorkeling in the Arctic. Well, they're not ours. So whose are they? So we've really got to get serious on the security front. And I'll tell you, Senator Sullivan, one of the Alaskan senators, has spanked us a few times on social media and in testimony in the U.S. Congress. But he's a big friend of Canada. He actually wants more partnerships there. So I really hope, liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter. I have my own preferences, but I think we need to show that we're going to lead. To use a line I've used many times, we the North. Jaden, that needs to be more than just the Raptors playoff run slogan. It needs to be part of our identity as Canadians. You may not ever get to the privilege of traveling to the North, but you know that we have to exert our sovereignty and we have to invest in that part of our country. So geopolitical security is the way I think most Canadians would say, yep, we do need a long-term multi-billion-dollar strategy for our North.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I think the key will be sovereignty is really presence. And so it's presence throughout Canada's North, and that means strong communities. And that means not only communities that do what's right by the people that currently live there, but also create communities that are able to take more people coming to build out the economies and to diversify the economy. And so we can spend on defense, but we also have to spend on the communities because you're in a region which we know from an industrial perspective, it's difficult. And it's difficult to build strong businesses over time and keep them strong consistently. And a resource economy will be subject to commodity price changes. And so you have to have that staying power, not just with industry, but you have to have that staying power and solid foundation and social infrastructure and communities to create that long-term presence. But not only the presence now, but the expanding presence that we're able to have play out as we create economic opportunity. So it has to be a very comprehensive strategy, and that's going to require government to take the lead and to pitch it to the rest of Canada. Why are we taking this slice out of our budget to invest in the North? Well, it's going to generate value for generations of Canadians. And a big part of that is our overall responsibility to Canadians and to North America to protect that northern flank.
Absolutely. And I think you both have made it pretty clear that that presence starts on the ground with infrastructure. So I'm going to pass it along to Nazia now, and she's going to dive deeper into infrastructure development.
Well, thank you very much. I did have some questions about development, but before that, as we think of the Arctic as important, we're going to dive into the type of infrastructures that we need to address. Sean, we know that you are a big advocate of the need for multi-use, multi-purpose infrastructure to address social, economic, and defense infrastructure needs. Do you have a specific example that could help listeners probably better understand what this might look like?
Well, I think from the social side, training's really important because there's lots of job opportunities. And we find that the current education system is not sufficient. It's not working. When we look to introduce more of the young population in the communities to trades, they need upgrading. So there needs to be investment in training. And what we're calling for when we are working through Nunavut is not just investment in green energy with the wind farm, not just investment in physical infrastructure around the site, but also in training investment. And the federal government has responded positively around training. So I think we need training because right now, currently, we're bringing a lot of the skilled trades from southern Canada. And that works, but that's not optimal because you're not getting the vast majority of that benefit on the ground. So that would be a huge benefit because I think what we see is the young people in the communities are looking for role models. They're looking for role models from their own communities. And if we give them the skills, there's no shortage of opportunity there. They can do and get to whatever level they choose to get to. So I think that will be really important because I sort of make it, see it similar to how we run our business. We have a mission statement. Yeah, we've got to produce above average long-term returns for our shareholders, but we have to make it a great place to work for our employees, and we have to uplift communities and our partners. And I see the same with the Arctic strategy. We can make investments and have, the best defense system and early warning system and emergency preparedness system, but if it's not benefiting the communities and the communities are weak and the infrastructure from a social perspective isn't there, then we failed. So that's what we've been saying is we've got to tie them all in together.
Thank you for your response. The environment is another area where co-development and cooperation is essential. So how does Agnico balance environmental stewardship and resource development in partnership with the local Inuit communities, which I know you answered previously, but let's tie that with environment.
Yeah, and that's critical because I think it's how you approach and how you conduct yourself. I think initially you have to get that right. And going back to that example when we first went to Baker Lake in 2007, our approach was, and that's the approach we take whether we're in northern Mexico in the Sierra Madres going into small communities, we view ourselves as visitors. And we're visitors on others' people's land. And as a result, we view our role as being a partner to help to optimize the opportunity set. So you have to do that. If you're not approaching it that way, if you're approaching it from the point of view as, look, we're a big business, we're here now, this is the way it is, and if you don't like it, too bad. No, you're never going to get anything done. So that ties into your approach in terms of how you manage things like caribou migration, how you manage water treatment. The vast majority of big mining companies have a high quality approach to managing environmental issues, and we're no different. And if we fail there, then we're not going to be doing business in Nunavut. But I think the key will be to unlock the potential is to answer the energy question. How do we get reliable, clean, affordable energy, not just for industry, but for the communities? And I like the way we're approaching Hope Bay is to build a wind farm so that we can source half of the power, buy it off the Nunavut Corporation that will actually own the wind turbines to satisfy 50% of the power needs. So we have to have that green solution. Longer term, though, it's our view, and we know talking to the federal government, that ultimately we think it's small modular reactors. Now, you may get pushback. Whoa, wait a minute, we're not sure about that long term. But there's a lot of work being done by a lot of high quality businesses on technology to make it safe, including here in Ontario with Ontario Power Generation. So we see that is the future. It's not there yet. It's going to take some years, but until we get clean, portable power and be able to move it around in the far north, we're not going to be able to take maximum advantage of the opportunities that exist there. And that'll be the most environmentally friendly way of actually unlocking that potential.
Let me speak to that for a minute because I think Sean raises a number of great points. When we did the most comprehensive Arctic sovereignty study in a generation in Ottawa, I helped lead that exercise. It's when Jessica and I first met. She was one of our experts that testified. A retired senator from the north, Charlie Watt, reminded Southern participants that we are not a park, is what he would say. And so the environment needs to be balanced. There's a lot of folks in the South that just want nothing happening in the North. And they don't realize that people need opportunity. The country needs critical minerals. It's about balance and responsible practices. And so I think when the Prime Minister, with no notice, Prime Minister Trudeau, with no notice to any of the territorial or Inuit leaders, signed an exploration ban for large swaths of the Arctic in Washington, that upset Northerners It violated the duty to consult, which is in our Constitution and is now part of the UN Declaration. But it's all about responsible practices and balance. And I think we're now getting to that where people see the Arctic as a very special place, but somewhere where there can be responsible development, there can be efforts to have lower carbon generation of electricity. All this is possible, but we have to, as former Senator Watt said, not look at the Arctic as some park that is a fantasy land. It is an important geopolitical place. It's an important part of where Northerners live and want to work and want their kids to stay. So they need opportunity. And when you go there and meet with the people on the ground, as our Foreign Affairs Committee did, you see it. So we were proposing small modular reactors way back in 2018 for the North for the reasons Sean outlined. And even the NDP agreed with that portion of our committee's findings because they saw um, each community in the North has to store 2 years worth of diesel on site to generate power because they may have a shipping issue and they need reliability of energy. And so there's these almost environmental time bombs sitting there with these huge storage. So can we get to a future where small modular reactors with transmission investments from the federal government and partnership to the private sector? Wind is even better, which is what Agnico is doing. But can we build reliability, low carbon, and low environmental footprint? All of these things are possible, but they take a balanced approach. And that should be a core part of any long-term strategy is environmental safeguards, respect, but also the duty to partner and to consult.
Let's pivot a bit and talk about logistics and the mining industry. Sean, once the gold comes out of the ground, what is the next part of the process? Where does the gold go? Specifically in its journey to get to global markets, is there an maritime component?
Well, that's one of the beauties of gold mining. Depending on the type of deposit and the deposits we have in the Arctic is what we produce is what's called a doré bar. So it'll be 80 to 90 pounds and it'll be 80% gold and it'll have some material in there that needs to be refined out. So essentially, the beauty of gold mining is we can basically take those doré bars and fly them out. And the procedure is we fly them to the mint in Ottawa for final refining. So unlike a large critical metals deposit or a base metal deposit, you'll be producing a concentrate of metals that would require transport through shipping, which would make things more expensive and more complicated. So I think that's one of the questions that the government has around gold mining is they say, okay, wait a minute, it's not a critical metal. So we're, as an economy and through energy transition, we need critical metals. We need to invest in critical metals. Well, we don't have a lot of critical metals deposits lined up ready to be built, but we do have infrastructure in the North that is engaged in gold mining. And it's that infrastructure that you need in place to then spawn critical metals deposits. So there is some simplicity in gold mining, which helps to keep the costs down. And we're fortunate that way.
So for Erin, if you can name one need, the biggest need that we have in terms of Arctic defense, what would that be?
It goes back to sovereignty, and that's really presence. And Sean mentioned that. And for the military, that presence, I think, can best be projected by submarines. So what we have in the North is archipelagos that really make our total mass a lot of coastline and a lot of maritime area. That can be patrolled through overflights, and we do that right now through auroras that fly out of both BC and Greenwood, Nova Scotia, that do overflights. It can be done on the ground through Canadian Rangers, who are Inuit leaders on the ground, trained to be out and to be the eyes and ears. increasingly drones. And I proposed several times modernizing a branch of the Canadian Rangers to allow younger Inuit to become proficient in maintaining and flying drones for everything from environmental to wildlife patrol. But if you want stealth and the ability to have your allies and adversaries know that you could be anywhere up there, um, the submarine asset is the best. The challenge here is, and I could go on for an hour on submarines, but there are two types. There's diesel and there's nuclear. Canada really has never been in the nuclear game because it's a much larger, much more engineering complex, and our ports in Esquimalt, British Columbia, and Halifax, Nova Scotia can't accommodate these large vessels. So we need probably to purchase a diesel submarine with technology that's called air independent propulsion, something that allows the submarine to operate under ice for periods of time, not for 6 months like a nuclear sub could, but in and around for several weeks of ice or near ice operations. And the fact that climate change is making a lot more of our Arctic sea area open water, that will allow us to have eyes and ears up there, both by stealth, but also as a projection of our sovereignty. So I've been advocating for this for several years, and I was quite happy that weeks ago in the NATO meetings in Washington, the Prime Minister and Minister Blair firmed up our commitment to have a competition to acquire this capacity. But it will be another example of a long-term investment that Canadians have to realize has a value for the Arctic. So we should continue doing what we're doing, but I think that submarine asset is really what we need to really be in the game and to take a leadership role in Arctic security.
Before passing over to Jaden, who's going to talk more about innovation and issues of innovation, perhaps one of the questions was about thinking. There's a lot of discussion about, when it comes to infrastructure, the importance of maritime infrastructure, so ports and connecting infrastructure in that sense, with an eye towards thinking that there is going to inevitably be more traffic going through our Northwest Passage. And so, in one sense, do we need more maritime infrastructure? Would this help the mining sector, or do we see everything going like south instead of off the coast? And is there an opportunity then, assuming that, well, and in what way does defense need maritime infrastructure? And is there some sort of opportunity there for thinking about multi-use maritime infrastructure?
So maybe I can just start on the mining side. So for critical metals deposits, base metal deposits, you'll need deep water ports in the north because you have to transfer or transport the concentrate. It's highly unlikely that you're building a large base metal smelter in the far north, given a lack of power, green power. So you'd likely be transporting that concentrate somewhere else. So you're going to need a deep water port, and I'm sure Erin would say we need a deep water port for military purposes as well. So it's where should that be to take advantage of being able to leverage off of both objectives. And what we've been saying to the Department of National Defense is that we should be talking so that we can basically lay out where the best potential for the next generation of mines are. So you're well aware where the best geology is. And so that may help frame, if you can move things and move them closer to where the best rocks are, then there's the much better opportunity to leverage off of both investments.
This is a great example, Jessica, of last year at the Arctic 360 conference, we had a bit of a discussion on how can we collaborate and overlay infrastructure investments to do exactly what Sean said. Where would it make the most sense from both a public national defense and security point of view to have a port, and for the private sector? Can we have complementary investments to fulfill multiple needs. That needs to be core to the strategy, not one-offs where this is good for the government and we've not even talked to the private sector or Indigenous groups. Uh, Collaborating and coming up with long-term commitments is an example. And as Sean said, you do need that deep water facility. You need to be able to um, build out infrastructure for maritime assets, whether that's ships, MCDVs, or a submarine or two. That needs to be the long-term plan. And it was great to see a bit of that happening at your conference. We need that to be the sort of normal approach in Ottawa so that we, as I said, Nanocivic, if we were planning that today, probably would not go there. And so, how do we make sure that when there's billions being spent over decades, that it has that multiplier effect? And so I think if we do this right, everyone's saying, how are we going to spend our NATO 2% target? What we've talked about right now spends it because these are major investments, but there will be huge benefit to everyone as Agnico helps the communities on the ground, the territories, and the country through their economic activity. So I think Canadians need to realize that these investments will lead to not just securing the North, they will lead to prosperity for people in the South.
In terms of defense innovation from cold weather to maritime in Canada, are we the innovators or are we the followers?
Um,
Oh.
I would say, unfortunately, we're the followers, but we could be the leaders. One thing I've proposed with respect to the submarines is this new ability for diesel submarines to go for prolonged periods submerged under ice or just submerged for being submerged without having to vent the fumes from diesel is to have air independent propulsion. We should become leaders in that. And I've said this, Canada has more coastline than any other country on earth. Why do we not lead the way in terms of these type of innovations? We have led the way in the past, Jaden. I flew on Sea King helicopters off the back of ships as a much younger man. And the innovation that allowed large helicopters to land on smaller naval ships, the bear trap system, as we call it, that was a Canadian innovation, mainly because we were getting out of the World War II aircraft carrier business, and we needed to innovate to make sure that we could have air assets on smaller vessels. Well, we came up with innovation because of our unique needs. My gosh, we should own this issue when it comes to the North and when it comes to technology that can help us do this. It's the same MR, going back to modular reactors. Not only was it in our report years ago, the first one in Canada is being built in my old riding at Darlington. This is something that Canada should also be a leader in this technology because of our remote communities, because of often the difficulty to get generation to whether it's the Arctic or whether it's even the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario. It's often power is the impediment. Well, we should be innovating out of need as a country. So I think that could also factor into our NATO 2% as well. So I'd like to see us get a lot more innovative in the defense space.
What do you think we would need to get there, like in terms of technology and innovation?
Well, again, this is a time where I think the private sector is showing the way and the government needs to just follow or get out of the way. you know, Jim Balzilli, who's been supportive of Arctic 360, participating in the conference last year, his group, the Canadian Council for Innovators, have approached really interesting ideas like a patent box, so that if you develop and commercialize a technology in Canada, you have special tax treatment on the wealth creation because you're not just coming up with the ideas here, you're commercializing it here. There's a lot of things that we could really do on a tax side to encourage Canadians to invest in the startup and scale up infrastructure. Some of that is happening, but not enough to really accelerate the way we need to go. But again, we have such incredible innovators. We're just not known as the easiest economy to scale up once you get that idea. And so we get so many people then leaving to go to California, Massachusetts. It's frustrating. So how can we change that? It's usually through the tax system and through partnering with the private sector.
Do you think we're missing opportunities to increase access for and prospects for Northern youth also living in the Canadian Arctic? For example, what sort of STEM studies would you suggest Northern youth wanting to play a bigger part in this Arctic innovation and technology role?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that. As we said earlier on in the podcast, is we find the system currently lacking, and that's the primary education, high school education. It's lacking, but education. We look at it as from two perspectives. Is the quality of the education system, I think, could be improved. But what we've been working on is this concept of university level education in Nunavut. And people say, well, why do we need that? We have an Arctic college, and we acknowledge that. But what we're saying is that we know there are many Inuit high school students who may want to go to university, but would like to stay closer to home. And we think this is an option, and we'd have to start small. And we're really sending a signal. And Agnico is on record as saying we'll put up the first $10 million to get that concept moving forward. And we've been on this case for about 9 years and have had very little take up, which doesn't kind of make sense to us because it's going to take leadership from the government level. And we think it's important to send a message of hope, send a message of the importance of education, the importance of higher education, because it's only going to work over time if we build a more diversified, broader, larger economy where the residents of Nunavut can, or the Northwest Territories, or wherever it is, can participate fully. And the best way to participate is education. So it should be a critical part of this strategy, is how do we ensure that we give the youth of Canada's North all of the opportunity to, not just drive a haul truck, but to lead and run these businesses and run these economies. And so that should be at the forefront of any strategy as we think about how to take advantage of the opportunities in the North.
Let me add
Yeah.
to that because I agree 100%. And I referred to earlier my suggestion about expanding the Canadian Rangers into drone and unmanned aerial vehicles. Um, this is a time where I think a lot of young people want our institutions to be shaken up a little bit and to be modernized. The Canadian Rangers came out of World War II and we're still using Lee Enfield rifles from World War II until about just 10, 15 years ago. Um, it's time for them to branch out to new technology and maybe appeal to younger Canadians at the time. The unbelievable asset that is young Indigenous Canadians. It's a large demographic group, but they're not going to want to just participate in the ways things were done in the 60s and 70s. So to Sean's point, the ability to get upgrading and university level training, the ability to have a role not just like Rangers had 30 years ago, but today. There's also in some of our defense procurement, if a foreign government is selling us jets or anything else, they have to offset some of that spending with investments in supply chain in Canada. There are Indigenous-led supply chain initiatives in defense. So making sure that Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics or any of these companies really maximize some of their investments in these supply chains and these startups that have Indigenous leadership, Indigenous owners, Indigenous employees. I've promoted having an accelerator so that you get extra offset credits for more Indigenous partnerships. So I think the some of the angst we're seeing and some of the polarization we're seeing is in part because the younger generation, millennials and younger, don't really see the old institutions as meeting their needs. So it's time to maybe shake it up a little bit, and maybe that's a future breaking the ice topic. Is how can we do that, and at the same time strengthen the institutions by making them more modern.
Absolutely. And I think actually Jaden is a perfect example. The youth are savvy. They're much more technologically savvy than us old folks. And one thing we talk about a lot with Arctic 360 and podcasts in the past and conference every year is about the need to have innovation out of the Arctic. And I think part of that is for Canada to kind of conceptually change the page and understanding that the Arctic is our place where we could be doing so much more innovation. And then therefore you have opportunities for youth to be doing precisely the things they want to be doing for the world we live in today. So I am just going to, I think we're going to wrap it up. This has been a really great conversation. We could talk for 10 hours, but everyone, especially Erin and Sean, have more important things to do. But I think I'm going to wrap it up by maybe actually stealing one of Erin's own things that he does often. He has his own podcast. Blue Skies, if you've never listened to it, you definitely should. But I like how Erin always likes to end everything on a positive and optimistic note. So maybe I'll just ask quickly, both of you, just in one way, do you have an optimistic perception or attitude about the future of Canada's North? And actually our ability to be a global leader in this space? And if there's one thing that stands out for that reason.
Absolutely. And that's why we're putting a lot of time and energy to explain what we see given our presence on the ground every single day and working in communities as we see that tremendous opportunity. And really to take advantage of it, we need to coordinate. And I think that's the sort of message that we're sending. And from our particular standpoint, as we think about the opportunities set in the North, we want to try to approach mine building a little bit differently. And it reminds us of our director our chairman at the time, when we reopened a mine in Val d'Or that we had to close. And it was a small investment. And after the meeting was finished and terminated, he said, do you know what we've just done here? We've made an investment, we expect a return, but this is an unbelievable announcement for the community where that mine is. And so that's why we are now sort of going beyond this idea of mine building and connecting it closely to community building, which is essentially what it is. But now, because of the importance of the North, taking it one step further and connecting that nation building aspect to it. And you'll see more from us over the next little while on that. And it's important as we announce something like Hope Bay next year to talk about community investments, whether it's the university idea, whether it's to help advance housing initiatives in the North. We're also focused on that in addition to how do we build a good mine at Hope Bay. So we're excited about that. We're very excited.
I love Sean's focus on community and building community. It reminds me of former Prime Minister Joe Clark's discussion of Canada as a community of communities, and it truly is. And I think we're all connected in the South and in the North, and we need to remember that. The most optimistic I am right now, Jessica, is the North can be the accelerator for Canada to get back into our traditional role in the world. I don't want to be too political here, but Canada's reputation has been in decline. I think it would be hard for anybody of any political stripe to say that we haven't been kind of marginalized a little bit, forgotten even by some of our closest friends and allies. The North is the ticket for people to see Canada serious again on the world stage. And that's on the critical minerals and mining and resource development. That's Indigenous reconciliation in action, actually showing it, not just doing a land acknowledgement and doing a lot of these symbolic things that aren't going to help people in those communities. Jobs, wealth creation, opportunity, that's exciting. And then, of course, the security piece. Our allies want Canada to be there. You know, the Alaska Highway that the US relied upon, that was our initiative. The North Warning System, our initiative. NORAD, our most important security alliance for homeland protection, that was our leadership and partnership in the North. So I think everybody wants to see Canada return to that. And right now, with the U.S. election cycle and NATO being questioned, and the new vice presidential Republican candidate, skeptical about U.S. leadership globally, and we could be entering an isolationist phase. We have to show that we're willing to meet our commitments, that we can be a reliable partner and friend, and the easiest way for us to do that is the North. So I'm incredibly optimistic and really, really appreciative of the fact that over the last half decade or so, Arctic 360 has really driven the dialogue, the collaboration, and the strategy discussion, so much so that Ottawa's playing catch up. So keep it up, Jessica and team, and whatever I can do, and I'm sure Sean's the same, we want to see more leadership in this space and appreciate yours.
Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Sean. I guess we'll end by saying, Team North is all of us, all Canadians, and thank you so much, and I do hope you will come back to join us again. And I really want to thank Nazia, Nicole, and Jaden for their job today, especially the first one out of the gate.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for our next episode of Breaking the Ice.
As a reminder, the views expressed on this podcast are the views of the participants alone and do not represent the views or opinions of Arctic 360, the Munk School of Global Affairs, or any other government or agency. Thank you for listening to Breaking the Ice. Follow Arctic 360 on social media to stay up to date on the latest podcast episodes and Arctic 360 content. You can find us on all streaming platforms, LinkedIn, and Twitter, or you can visit our website at arctic360.org. Thank you for listening. This is Breaking the Ice.